welcome everyone. I think we're just going to get started now. Thank you for all joining us this evening. A little bit of housekeeping before we start. I think I did mention to you all who've joined that if you can keep your audio off for the duration of this webinar, that would be great. There will be a time at the end for some questions and answers. There'll be a Q&A as at the end part of this presentation. We'd love to hear your thoughts and reflections and also your questions throughout the course of the event. So if you've got anything for more generally you'd like to share, or more specifically for some of the speakers, if you'd like to put them in the chat, we can manage that and then pose them at the end in the Q&A section. There's quite a lot of people attending tonight, so I think to try and manage an open participatory part of it might be difficult. So if you want to put your questions in the chat, that would be great. Also, just to say that we are recording the event and we'll do a quick edit on it and share it across our YouTube in the days ahead. So a little bit of a format for the evening. I'm going to do a short introduction to the work of the archive, then hand over to Hussein. After that, Lauren Forde will be doing her presentation. We'll have a quick comfort break. Then it'll go into Henry Bell and then some Q&A with Rodge Glass before final thanks and a goodbye. Okay. Get going. So I just wanted to start off by giving a quick introduction to myself and to tonight's event. My name's Sorcha Dallas, my pronouns are she, her, and I'm the custodian of the Alasdair archive. I worked with Alasdair since 2007 and was responsible for bringing his visual work to a wider attention. My practice lies in the visual arts scene, where the radical really lies in self-initiated action. And this is something that I've always striven for within my own practice, and really as curator, through developing an approach with how I've been engaging and unlocking Alasdair's collection here at the Alasdair archive. Over the last 5 years, I've been exploring and creating a new model for curating an artist's archive beyond the institutional boundary through the work at the Alasdair archive. And a big part of what I do is, of course, caring for Alasdair's collection, which I've installed to look like his cosy front room in his last home, where all the materials came from. But I'm also interested in proactively shaping it through my own curatorial role as its custodian. So the archive is really installed to look like a cosy, welcoming space that prioritises handling and engagement of the collection to make it a very immersive and tactile experience. Can I just pause for a moment and ask if you've got your audio on, if you could please turn it off, please, because it's interfering with the sound of the recording. Thank you. What I've been developing over the last few years is this creative ecosystem model, which really aligns the three ways in which we work with the collection under our creative commissioning, education, and public engagement. And we'll talk through a couple of examples of that work. So this is a little bit about some of the public engagement that we've been working on. We've been creating talks and events, both online and in person, alongside, we've just recently done our big annual Grey Day event, or more where we really celebrated and showcased a lot of the creative commission work that we've been delivering in partnership with others. We do free weekly tours of the collection, so if you're local to Glasgow or a wee bit further afield and you want to come and book in for those, you can do that too. We do Doors Open Day events, as well as designing digital and bespoke online works as well. And the Poor Things digital guide was something that we created to coincide with the Yorgos Lanthimos adaptation that came out last year. Education is a kind of core part of what we do as well. We really believe, like Alasdair, in the right to access culture by all. So we are currently hosting 25 students on a range of different placements. We've got 2 collaborative doctoral awards that we co-supervise, alongside developing with teachers, school resources, alongside delivering CPD training for them too. We're also about to develop our archive and create a satellite archive, which is the first of many that we're planning to do, with the first being the Agnes Owens archive, which is opening towards the end of this year, with celebratory plans around her centenary in 2026. Big part of the creative commissioning is making a case for Alasdair's work and the resource here being generative. So we're not just fixing it historically, we're showing and proving the value of it by engaging with others. And it's really mirroring Alasdair's own approach to making, which is rooted in the practice of others. So we've been working with various different partners over the last 5 years, including more recently the Glasgow International Comedy Festival, where we celebrated our 3 new comedic interpretations to Alasdair's collection as part of Grey Day, and also as part of the Comedy Festival, which is happening next weekend too. If you want to find out more about any of the work that we do, please follow us on social media or go onto our website, and you can find a little bit more about some of the work that I've spoken about here too. that's all the details there if you want to follow us across any of platforms as well. So really now I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight's event, which is really the outcome of a project that we've been working on, which is called Exploring Colonialism and Alasdair Gray's Poor Things project. And this is a project that's been supported through resourcing from the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities Global Connect Fund, and it's delivered in partnership with our good friends at Creative Writing at the University of Strathclyde. So Alasdair Gray's 1992 novel Poor Things contains a forceful critique of imperialism and depicts Glasgow in its imperial heyday as the second city of the British Empire. This research project has unpacked some of the historical references and fictional devices Gray uses to illuminate questions of empire, colonialism, self-determination, and political geography, paying close attention to the note's critical and historical section at the end of the novel. This project has been delivered by the brilliant Hussein Mitha, who has sensitively explored this text via research and a wonderful facilitative workshop held at AGA last year, which you can see a few images from here too. At this workshop, Hussein shared a presentation and discussion, then supporting participants to undertake a creative writing exercise, taking factual prompts relating to Glasgow's imperial history to reimagine Bella Baxter in contemporary Glasgow. So tonight, Hussein will share their outcomes from this research project, from which we are going to be developing an accessible resource that we will share in the months ahead. So without further ado, let me introduce Hussein. Hussein has a diverse practice that incorporates writing, organising, workshops and collective learning platforms, mural making and collaboration with other artists and community groups. Their debut collection, Vegetal Soul, was published by Rosie's Disobedient Press in 2023, and it has been really inspiring to work with them on this project. So over to you, Hussein.
Thank you so much, Sorcha, and it's been really wonderful to work with you and to be welcomed into the fold at the Alasdair Gray Archive. And thanks for all the inspirational work that you do. Yeah, I guess I just want to start by saying like it's a huge privilege to be able to explore Alasdair Gray's work. And, I think one of the things about Gray and colonialism is that it's often relegated to a minor theme within studies of his oeuvre, but I think it's also like that thing that once you start looking for something, you kind of see it everywhere. And I just want to really double down on the fact that Gray's rage against empire is not a kind of incidental part of his work, but it's a very thorough and permeating across his whole oeuvre. And I guess before we get into Gray and colonialism and my presentation, I just want to say a few words about Palestine, especially in light of what's been happening over the last 24 hours. And, one thing that I hope we can all get from this session is a spur from Alasdair Gray and from Gray's rage against empire to encourage us all to do a lot more towards Palestinian liberation, something which actually featured in Gray's anti-colonial commitments, especially towards the end of his life. But yeah, last night saw one of the deadliest massacres of the last 18 months in Gaza. In one night alone, over 400 Palestinians were martyred, including 174 children. It is incumbent on all of us to use whatever leverage we have, whether through cultural boycott, blockading arms factories, or participating in political education around anti-colonialism and the colonization of Palestine. And just on that last point, the colonization of Palestine didn't just begin in 1948 with the Nakba, but it began actually here in the imperial metropole in the 19th century. And given that today's topic is a well-beloved literary figure, I also just wanted to say a couple of words about Ghassan Kanafani, the Palestinian literary figure who was a novelist, a short story writer, but much like Gray, also a visual artist, and a teacher, also like Gray. and Kanafani wrote a study called On Zionist Literature, in which he looks at the British literary canon of the 19th century, everyone from George Eliot to Benjamin Disraeli. Um, um, and he also talks about Shakespeare. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that his argument in that book is that literary Zionism preceded its political form. And I think we, in terms of the discourse around decolonization, when it comes to, you know, our cultural institutions, universities, etc., I think we really have to think about the fact that the horrors we're witnessing in Palestine right now stems from the imperial metropole. Another key figure that Kanafani talks about in that book is Sir Walter Scott. And it's interesting to think about Walter Scott not just as the founder of a kind of modern Scottish identity, but also involved in the founding of Israel. So I think we in Scotland, in the rest of the UK, and in the imperial metropole more broadly, I think we really have a duty to unwind and unlearn some of what's been instituted in our names. I'll also just say that I organise with a group called Art Workers for Palestine Scotland, and we're trying to do that kind of work of decolonising the arts and cultural sector in Scotland. And we have a campaign around PACB, which is the Palestinian-led campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And we just encourage everyone to get involved in that campaign. And in Scotland, over 160 organisations have signed up to PACB, which is the densest per capita signing up for PACB anywhere in the world. And I think that's also testament to the radical undercurrents and currents that are running through Scottish culture. And I think maybe Henry will speak to that as well. And that is also in no small part due to the enduring presence of Alasdair Gray. So without further ado, I will attempt to start this presentation if I can work it out. Can everyone see that? Is that visible to people?
Yep.
Great. And also, yeah, just to echo what Sorcha was saying, that please do feel free, like, to make this as discursive and dialogical as possible. Please do leave reflections in the chat, which we'll be able to see as we go along. It's quite hard to get an open discussion going on Zoom, but please use the chat as that kind of as that space where, yeah, it would be great to just see reflections. Or I'm no expert in Alasdair Gray. I'll say this: I've like long admired his work, but there are people probably in the audience who know it much better than me. So please do feel free to chip in at any point. I'm just going to make this bigger. Just checking that everyone can see that.
Yep, that's good to go.
So really what I wanted to do was just one, discuss Poor Things, which obviously contains Gray's most kind of sustained engagement with the question of colonialism and the British Empire. But then also to look at kind of snapshots and extracts from across Gray's oeuvre, both the visual aspect as well as you know, the literary side. So yeah, as we can see, this motif from Hillhead Station mural, it also features, you know, depicting these quite bombastic, early modern, quite pompous looking colonialists, colonists. This is a motif that recurs throughout Gray's works, especially the later ones. So it features in some short story collections, etc. And yeah, again, working back from the end of his life, his poem "Naming Britain," I think, is a really wonderful, a wonderful example of how Gray thinks about empire in relation to this question of nation and this question of political geography. So I'll just quickly read these three stanzas. It's actually a fair bit longer, but I won't read the whole poem. To gain an empire on which the sun never sets, the English explored, traded, fought, and won mastery of the sea and vast subcontinents, helped by Scots and Irish, whose parliaments were both in the past, but left such outsiders a say in the British Empire, though the USA, hating taxation by London, had broken away. Commercial empire remains, promoting war with drug and weapon sales, while parliaments in Ulster, Scotland, Wales do not stop the English government sending their troops to fight in distant lands when America's chief war businessman commands. Ulster Protestants may be the last to gladly claim the British name. Britain is still that irregular archipelago to which the Pythias came. And I just love that the last image of that poem of, thinking of Britain not as this kind of reified political identity, but actually just a broken archipelago. And I think one of the kind of things that we'll see throughout the course of this presentation, hopefully, is the way that Gray conceives of the project of Scottish self-determination as dovetailing within an anti-imperial kind of balkanization of Britain that ends the British Empire. So I think it'd be interesting to hear what people think about this proposition as well. But I don't think you can separate Gray's kind of views on Scottish independence and national self-determination from his desire to break apart British imperialism. I think they're part of the same process. And then, yeah, moving on to Poor Things. Me, Belle, Miss Baxter, citizen of Glasgow, native of Scotland, subject of the British Empire. I just think it's worth thinking through the citizen, native, and subject, and thinking about how in Gray you often have these kind of overlapping identities in which there's, an interplay, and sometimes that kind of pulls away, subject, native pulls away from each other to some degree. But it's interesting to see this in the coming from the mouth of Bella Baxter as she tries to understand who she is. And yeah, I think this is also something that I kind of realized while I was putting together this work, is that nothing is ever fixed in Gray when it comes to especially national identity. Gray is a real thinker of historical processes and not kind of static ontological fixed identities, but he's always looking at how these historical processes yield certain conjunctures at certain times. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of remember and hold on to, especially when we are talking about colonization, racism. Race is not a fixed, essential ontological category of being. It's a process that's enacted on people. And then, yeah, in Poor Things again, we have, sorry, I just need to move this. Yeah, this is from Wedderburn's letter, and Wedderburn is slightly unhinged, but I think this is part of the satire of imperialism that Gray provides. I'll just read from the first bit of that. The British Empire is the largest empire the world has ever known. It is wholly material, being based on industry, trade, and military might. It was invented in Glasgow. Here, James Watt conceived the steam engine, which drive the British rail trains and merchant fleets and battle fleets. And then he goes on to talk about how Adam Smith invented capitalism. Again, like Gray's history is quite bombastic, but these are provocations, and these are, here Adam Smith invented modern capitalism. But I think, Gray's Glasgow is really at the heart of the imperial project, and it's interesting to see the way that this is staged by different characters in Gray. Also, just in the second image on that screen, just at the bottom, though Queen Victoria prefers Edinburgh to Glasgow, Balmoral to the rest of Scotland, the Grand Duke Alexis, son of the Tsar of Russia, called Glasgow the centre of intelligence of England. Again, just thinking about the kind of hilarity of that misrecognition that, again, pointing to the fact that national identity in Grey is far more complex than I think sometimes we might think, but that misrecognition of the Tsar of Russia calling Glasgow the center of intelligence of England, very interesting. Also, I think that speaks to other kind of ambiguities in the novel. Especially, I'm thinking of the gesture to Lee as a Tsarist double agent, which again I think points to the kind of the radical instability of national identity within Grey. And then yeah, I found this quite fascinating. I hear that in Britain the lower class is predominantly Irish, and this made me think of the Stuart Hall quote. Stuart Hall, who's one of the founders of cultural studies. Race is the modality in which class is lived. And I think, thinking about Grey, um, um, race is linked to class. And I think that comes across here. I hear that in Britain, the lower class is predominantly Irish. So again, thinking of, the way that Grey figures things is through thinking about historical processes and thinking about how race and class intersect. Um, um, And then, yeah, Poor Things understands an imperial troika that facilitates colonial domination, and um, this becomes very clear in that scene, in those passages between which are kind of like discussion between Dr. Hooker, an American missionary, Harry Astley, a capitalist, a businessman. Again, whether he's English or not, I think is quite an interesting question. And then the military embodied by General Blessington, like an unforgettable character. Um, and in the interest of saving time, I won't dwell on this, but um, Dr. Hooker's justification for colonialism is to improve people. We cannot improve people suddenly everywhere. The bullying rulers of the inferior races hate to see us replace them. So to teach them some sense, we first of all have to thrash them. Our rifles and machine guns and ironclad warships and superior military discipline ensure that we always do thrash them, but the process takes time. From their headquarters in the tiny island of Britain, the Anglo-Saxons have conquered over a quarter of the planet in little more than 2 centuries. And then, yeah, we have the figure of Blessington, very much a kind of Colonel Blimp figure for those who've seen the Powell and Pressburger film. Um, on the right, we see a list of his colonial conquests, which are essentially, dispatch notes, but they're really, a series of colonial massacres that he's participated in, including crushing the Indian Mutiny. Um, uh, and yeah, you have this long list of um, genocidal massacres in a way that I think maybe the Powell and Pressburger film was in Gray's mind when he was writing this, because in that film you have the kind of red-faced bombastic British general, the Colonel Blimp figure, and on his wall you see souvenirs from his imperial conquests, sort of like peppered across his wall. A thoroughly loathsome figure, General Sir Aubrey de la Pole Blessington, and you get the sense that Gray relished satirizing him in that book. And then, yeah, towards the end of the novel, the notes critical and historical. It's really interesting that the whole novel is a kind of very contested paper trail, and this section, which appears right at the end, with its very much like the newsprint style, very much seems to be at the almost at the historical core of the novel. It's even though it's a kind of like slightly marginal like end notes, but there suddenly you encounter as a reader these moments of like graphic pictorial truth. Um, and one of these images, the one on the top right, actually depicts um, auctioning loot in Mandalay after the Burmese expedition. And in that way, taking the loot from the colonized and distributing it among soldiers. Again, I think that is a little way of Gray talking about how some of the oppressed who are, are soldiers and are in the army are also given this kind of colonial currency to keep the whole colonial process going. And then I just wanted to pick up a note about Burma. This is from Radical Glasgow Tours. There are extensive colonial links between Glasgow and Burma, oh, particularly Rangoon. I can't actually, whoops. I need to move. Oh, yeah. There are extensive colonial links between Glasgow and Burma, and particularly Rangoon, so much so that it was sometimes known as the Scottish colony. In the early expansion of the imperial core city, the streets were laid out by a Scotsman on a grid system based on Glasgow's. The city's factories and yards sent steam engines, wrought iron, locomotives, and machinery to Burma. In the rice industry, the steam-powered engines that separated the rice grain from the husk were built in the iron foundries of Lanarkshire and then distributed throughout Burma by Scottish firms. Back in Glasgow in 1938, the colonial possession of Burma was one of the regions showcased at the Empire exhibition in Bellahouston Park. The Burma Pavilion, which you can see on the cigarette card, sorry, I didn't put the image there, was one of many which sought to illustrate the progress of the British Empire at home and overseas. And I mean, this is something that we all know about colonialism, but the kind of like radical disjoint between how colonialism is framed at home to domestic audiences and the brutality of colonial domination in the colonies is really, is part of the kind of schizophrenia of the bourgeois mind that allows these two things to exist side by side. But I mean, even just geographically, just to think that the kind of grid system that we all know in Glasgow, or those of us who live in Glasgow know from Glasgow, was later implanted into Burma. And then, yeah, just thought I'd include some responses to Poor Things by others. This is by Gabriela de la Puente. The book is absolutely soaked in Alasdair Gray's blunt review of life and hell on earth. The British Empire, and also just to dwell on that notion of the city as hell. I think this comes through in a lot of Gray's works, and even recently in a short story in Gotham magazine, which was part of an Alasdair Gray archive commission. The writer Joey Simons looks at this this kind of recurring thing of Glasgow as hell, the imperial city as hell. The British Empire, white supremacy, man-made inequality, and the suffering of the proletariat, drenched in it. All my favorite fiction is actually a roundabout form of criticism, so it's no wonder I love this book so much. I love it when an artist creates a grand image, something surreal and perfect and comfortable in its own fantasy, and then takes a sharp blade and goes at it, cutting a line straight through the middle to reveal the real world this thing is only temporarily covering up. And again, I just think that kind of speaks to what I was thinking about the notes critical and historical, that you can, the Poor Things as a fictional work is fabula. It's fantasy, and yet it contains these kind of piercing truths. And then also I thought I'd look at Chitra Ramaswamy's amazing text, Rich Things, which again was an Alasdair Gray Archive commission last year. When I first read Poor Things, it was 1997. I was 18. I thought it was about feminism. when I next read Poor Things, it was 2022 and I was 43. I thought it was about colonialism. This is how books change us. This is how we change books. This is how history is archived in us, like works on a page. And I just think that's such a beautiful kind of sentiment. And I also think it is true of great works of art that they contain more than the sum of their parts. They contain an excess of meaning, a surplus of meaning that is accessible to different generations and different people in different ways, without wanting to sound too essentializing or glib. I think that is what great works of art do. And even just to go back to Hassan Kanafani, I think, there's an interview that he gave where he's talking about his 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 politics actually emerged from his fiction because he was able to look back at his fiction and see that it contained politics. So I think also the number of people that have been interested in coming to tonight's event show that there's a depth of interest in thinking about colonialism in Grey, and I hope other people will continue that work. And then, yeah, so that's kind of Poor Things. And then I thought I'd just take you on like a whistle stop tour through some other texts. I don't know how we're doing for time, but I'll try and be quick. So this text is from Why Scots Should Rule Scotland, which he wrote in 1992, sort of the same time as Poor Things came out. And he later wrote a revised version in 97. I won't read this out, but he talks about the Darien venture. So for those who don't know about the Darien venture, the failure of the Darien scheme led to the uniting of the Scottish and English crowns and Parliament. Sorry, not the crowns, just the Parliament. So led to the Act of Union, basically. And this was because an attempt at creating a Scottish empire failed, involving £400,000 that the Scottish ruling class invested in this scheme to colonize somewhere in Panama, which is equivalent to half of the wealth of Scotland at the time. So it's interesting to also think about the Act of Union as something which stemmed from a failed colonial project. And it's also worth thinking about how the Scottish ruling class really wanted an empire to rival the East India Company in the British Empire. And then his very controversial Settlers and Colonists from 2012. Be very interested to hear what people think of this in the Q&A, this text, which was very controversial at the time. I belong to a small nation that for centuries has exported more soldiers and weapons than the defense of it ever needed, and now contains more destructive nuclear missiles and launching machines than any other nation outside of the USA. England has the good sense to contain hardly any. I hope the reform of Britain starts in Scotland. And again, thinking through Gray's kind of anti-colonial commitments, a lot of them stem with like a visceral revulsion at militarism. And I think that more than anything is at the root of a lot of Gray's ethical positions. And I guess like a lot of leftists of Gray's generation, the CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was a huge part of that politics and that worldview. And it's quite interesting just to think that given the like situation now, the rapid rearmament that our ruling class is wanting to carry out, and yet CND doesn't really exist in the same way anymore. I guess a lot of CND activists went off into doing climate activism, but I think taking a stand against militarization is more important now than ever. And then here we have a short story that Gray wrote, which is about his participating in the march against the Iraq War, 15th February 2003. I'll just read this out quickly because it's a really lovely passage. Arriving with my wife and lawyer friend, I am amazed by the many crowds spreading from the Triumphal Arch before Glasgow High Court to the People's Palace in the east and the Clyde on the south. All demonstrations contain weirdly dressed people, but here they are so outnumbered as to be invisible. Sort of having a slight dig at the cranks there, Alasdair Gray. Yet this multitude is splendidly ununiform, though I hear the women of the Eurydice Socialist Choir singing a peace song, and some vendors of the Scottish Socialist Party newspaper. There are people of every age, from toddlers in prams pushed by parents to elderly men like me. Some carry doves made of white polystyrene. There are many printed placards saying, "Make war on want, not Iraq. Not in my name, Mr. Blair. No blood for oil," and asking for Palestinian liberation. A nice woman upholds a "I trust no bush but my own." A stout bearded gent shows the Dumfries aging hippies against the war logo. Two boys, 10 or 11, walk carefully side by side, wearing a single sandwich board made of card with slogans written in fiber-tip pen. They seem to have no adult presiding with them. I just love this image of pathos at the end of the two boys with their placards, who are seemingly unaccompanied. And it just also makes me think about how children and the sense of moral clarity and moral outrage that children have expressed during this genocide of Palestinians puts a lot of adults to shame. And just thinking about, Gray focusing on this image of the two boys as well. And then, yeah, Old Men in Love is interesting as well because it spans the kind of like New Labour years in its kind of span. And again, that the stuff about the Iraq War, Gray sort of also puts in Old Men in Love. I just thought I'd read out this passage. The following chapters explain how Scottish people's land, rock, soil, distribution, mineral resources, waters, and those great political dynamos, the sea locks, ensure that all those who live and work here come to feel a part of it, like the Irish who came to found Dalriada and later fled here from the potato famine, the Anglo-Saxons who escaped across the border from Duke William and Margaret Thatcher, that's someone like me, for example, into the Lothians, Jews driven here by Tsarist and Nazi pogroms, Italians by the phylloxera epidemics that destroyed their vineyards, Indians, Pakistanis, Chinese, and other former subjects of the British Empire, together with refugees from wars Britain had fought since then and who are now wickedly labelled asylum seekers. I believe that all who stay to live, work, and vote here will invigorate this nation that has always been a colloquium of different people, as every sane nation must be. And then, yeah, this kind of complements his thinking for an unrealised mural for the Scottish Parliament. My idea would be a gigantic mural in the new Scottish Parliament, which would have in the foreground a frieze of all the different kinds of people who make up modern Scotland, all the races and nationalities and trades and professions. So yeah, Gray's nationalism is never as simple as how some of the critiques of Gray's positions, especially the critics of why Scots should rule Scotland and settlers and colonists, I think they kind of totally misrepresent his positions. And then this, just to give an example of how bizarre some of these permutations are of Gray's kind of thinking of the relationship between political power, political geography, nation, and class. An ominous start to an unsatisfactory day, wakened from a dream of a Scottish Pope being fascist President Prime Minister of Anglo-America and making torture on television a popular entertainment. I mean, just totally amazing and bizarre. Every politician and cardinal in his government was a Scottish thug who spoke with an English accent, etc., etc. So again, just to give that, the complexity of the way that these things are being figured in Gray's unconscious. And then here a quote from Rodge, who maybe will want to speak to this later. All Gray's political books open with extended section dedicated to the events of history. We all make the same mistakes repeatedly, he suggests. Margaret Atwood made the point when she wrote, "Those whose houses burned, burned houses," documenting how Scots driven from their homes in the Highland clearances promptly went over to Canada to do the same to others. And again, this is the kind of colonial currency that I was talking about, but also I think it puts very succinctly the way that Gray is a historical writer, but not in a kind of, you always get the sense that there's something at stake when Gray's writing history, that he's trying to work things out. He's not aiming for a kind of like objective facticity. He's trying to use history to go somewhere, as it were. Sorry, that was quite clunkily put, but I hope you get the idea that he's writing history. He's not just, it's part of an experimental process, I think. And history is so important to him. And actually, this is a question that I wanted to ask Rodge maybe later, but I get the sense that Gray kind of realized his political role increasingly as he aged. Like I get the sense that he also understood more in his later work and his later political action, the fact that he was a political actor. But it'd be interesting to hear Rodge's take on that, or indeed anyone's. And then, yeah, thinking about his CND activism, Alasdair stood with us and then decided that he would be arrested as well as protesting. So he went down the road and was almost immediately lifted up by a couple of cops and was led away to warm applause. And you get the sense that he sort of relished the limelight of being arrested like that to warm applause. But yeah, this is one way in which he actually inhabited that kind of role of a politicized and political figure. Gray and Palestine, again, references to Palestine crop up in Gray's works, and I won't speak to these poems because I think Henry, who was one of the editors of this collection, A Bird Is Not a Stone, translations of Palestinian poets by Scottish poets, like a wonderful, wonderful book. And I'll leave Henry to talk more about that. But these are Gray's translations in that book. I think there are only two, but maybe Henry would want to correct. And then I just thought on this question of race, again, somehow it hasn't really been commented on the fact that Adam is of a much darker. This is like one of my favorite paintings ever, I think, and it's just so beautiful. But Eden and After, which is also based on a mural now destroyed for the Greenhead Church. And Sorcha was telling me that there was hardly any press for this. The Greenhead Church mural, it was hardly mentioned in the press apart from one article called An Atheist Paints God, which is quite an amazing title for an article, but one person picked up on the fact that Adam is darker skinned, and just to think about the harmoniousness of this image and how it kind of speaks to our shared humanity, obviously in an erotic image, but yeah, very beautiful. And then I'd just like to end with the words of Dr. Ghassan Abusita, who is the rector of Glasgow University, about how all of this is really connected. And yeah, given that Gray's poem also begins with a mention of Lenin, I thought I'd read out this passage. At the beginning of the 20th century, Lenin predicted that real revolutionary change in Western Europe depended on its close contact with the liberation movements against imperialism and in the slave colonies. Glasgow University students understood what we have to lose when we allow our politics to become inhuman. They also understand what is important and different about Gaza is the laboratory in which global capital is looking at the management of surplus populations. They stood next to Gaza and in solidarity with its people because they understood that the weapons that Benjamin Netanyahu uses today are the weapons that Narendra Modi will use tomorrow. The quadcopters and drones fitted with sniper guns used so deviously and effectively in Gaza, efficiently in Gaza, that one night the Al-Ahli hospital, we received over 30 wounded civilians shot outside our hospital by these inventions. Used today in Gaza will be used tomorrow in Mumbai, in Nairobi, and in Sao Paulo. Eventually, like the facial recognition software developed by the Israelis, they will come to Easter House and Springburn. And yeah, I just think our engagement with anti-colonialism only means something if we can take a stand against the horrors of the genocidal present, not only because this is what given capitalism's accelerated crises, and the management of surplus populations. I mean, you can see that just from how the Labour government want to commit an act of social murder by killing disabled people. Imperialism there in the colonies is connected to social murder here in the core. And I think Gaza is one moment of utter clarity that we just can't ignore. And yeah, we just encourage everyone to take the spur from Alasdair Gray's vision of a shared humanity, and which is a profoundly humane vision and a profoundly human vision. And the more that we can hold that up against the horrors of the present, the better. So I'll just end my sharing there. Has that worked?
Yeah, thank you, Hussein. Thanks so much for your really vital and important research. Also, I know it was almost an unenviable task, right, to try and interrogate all of this within Gray's wider oeuvre. You kind of fixed a project starting with the notes historical and critical, but appreciate the wider connections that you've explored as part of that. And for those of you who are interested, we're going to be working with Hussein and trying to bring this together into a resource that we'll be sharing over the months ahead. But also to say that the Alasdair Gray Archive stands in solidarity with PACB as well. We're one of the named organisations as part of that too. So I want to hand over next to Lauren.
Sorry, could I just quickly speak to a point that was raised in the chat, just very briefly. In the chat, Alasdair says, not sure that describing Glasgow as the centre of intelligence of England really is a misrecognition. I only mean in the sense that Glasgow isn't actually part of England. So it's, it's a kind of like jokey misrepresentation. That's all I meant.
Thanks, Hussein. So we now introduce Lauren Forde. So Lauren is our collaborative doctoral award student with Strathclyde University, who's funded through the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities. Her research has been exploring Alasdair Gray's portrayal of Glasgow as a disappearing city, and in line with Gray's interdisciplinary approach, and to support the development of her thesis, Lauren will also be adopting the medium of film to investigate Gray's literary and visual work in tandem, using elements from her oral history interviews that she's been recording as part of her research. She's already contributed a great deal to the archive and our growing Gray community. Her PowerPoint presentations are especially rich in sharing her research in such a kind of visually arresting way. So it's my great pleasure to now hand over to Lauren, who will take you through the next PowerPoint.
Hello, can you see that?
Yep, carry on.
Thank you. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me along. And yeah, I was really interested in Hussein's research. So that was great to hear, and yeah, very valuable. I'm just So yeah, my name is Lauren Forde, and as Sorcha said, I'm a SGSAH funded researcher, and I'm doing a collaborative doctoral award with the University of Strathclyde and the Alasdair Gray Archive. And my thesis is exploring Alasdair Gray's portrayal of Glasgow as a disappearing city. And today I'm going to be sharing some of my research on Poor Things, exploring the transformation of Victoria Hattersley into Bella Baxter as an allegory for Glasgow's transformation from an industrial city to European city of culture in 1990. For those unfamiliar with Alasdair Gray, he often described himself as a fat, spectacled, balding, increasingly old Glasgow pedestrian. It's a classically Scottish self-depiction, but Alasdair was, of course, so much more than this. He was a working-class Scottish polymath who, with over 65 years of output, turned Glasgow into a city of the imagination by harnessing a specific technique using words and paint to create a kaleidoscopic view of what he considered Glasgow to be, a disappearing city. In the Alasdair Gray archive, there is evidence of Gray's devotion to Glasgow, which we can see in Gray's ledger from the 1950s, which he found in a skip and then repurposed as a civic history book, which contains sketches, photographs, newspaper clippings, and diary entries documenting the Kirkcaldy area of Glasgow before much of it was demolished to create the Inner Ring Road, a motorway that was built through predominantly working class and previously industrious areas of Glasgow. The ledger is the genesis of one of Gray's most prolific paintings called Kirkcaldy Streetscape in the 50s, which is now on permanent display in Kelvingrove Art Gallery and Museum. And the painting captures a panoramic, surrealist view of Kirkcaldy's pre-motorway, ultimately preserving a view of the area that now no longer exists. In one particularly poignant entry in the ledger, Gray outlines a fragility that he saw in Glasgow and the power that he found within his practice. He wrote, "Oh, when I consider the litter of ideas and writings, doodles and deliberate sketches, fragments of verse and prose I accumulate as I live, they seem not to be an assortment of activities, but parts of a single effort to redeem experience totally. For the tiniest fragment from years back may become the seed of a new picture or provide the only detail which will complete a poem or give exactness to a scene. I have the power and the patience to reconstruct my own lost civilization from the scraps in my middens. I want my art to use all my life, make all of it significant, redeem it completely." This line allows us to see Glasgow through Gray's eyes as a field of inspiration where his sketches and writing can become seeds to grow new works that reconstruct Glasgow, what he considered as his disappearing city, his lost civilization. Now, you may be wondering, like I have for the past 2 years, has Glasgow disappeared? We've still got the Clyde, a north, south, east, and west. We've still got museums and art galleries, libraries, parks, and a huge People Make Glasgow sign, which aims to endorse the power of Glasgow's people in defining the city's identity. The Glasgow of the past and Glasgow of the future will often seem like two different places, but they are both still Glasgow. The city hasn't totally disappeared, but it has changed, adapted, evolved, and transformed into a different version of itself. Arguably, it's perception of the city that has transformed, the longing for a time that has passed, which made Gray view Glasgow as a place that had disappeared. We can't ever return to Glasgow's past physically, but what Alasdair Gray spent his life doing was documenting the way that things were in the city, allowing us an opportunity now and in the future to return there imaginatively. So if it truly is the people who make Glasgow, then what can they tell us about how Glasgow has transformed? For those unfamiliar with the novel, Poor Things is a Victorian Gothic pastiche which is made up of 3 sections which offer 2 opposing accounts of one woman's origins. The novel begins with an introduction written by the fictional editor, who's curiously named Alasdair Gray, and it's in the introduction that we learn that the main body of the novel is a Victorian memoir written by Archibald McCandless. In Archibald McCandless's account, he tells the story of a pregnant woman who attempts to end her own life by jumping into the Clyde. Her body is rescued and she's resurrected by a Glaswegian scientist called Godwin Baxter, who replaces her own brain with that of her unborn child's. So this Frankenstein-esque creation made up of a baby's brain and an adult body becomes known as Bella Baxter, who starts her life again with a new identity psychologically, but carrying this new identity is her old body with the physical memory of her past. The second account is told through a letter from Victoria McCandless, who claims the real identity of Bella Baxter and refutes all the fantastical elements told in Archibald's memoir, offering a more lifelike take on the events that led her to the scientist Godwin Baxter. Today, I'll be focusing on Archibald's account of Victoria Hattersley's transformation into Bella Baxter, and what I'm interested in exploring is the ways in which we can view this as an allegory for Glasgow's transformation from an industrial city into the European city of culture in 1990. So why am I doing this? Kirsten Sterling led the way in exploring Bella Caledonia as a national representation of Scotland and an avenue to explore the disparity between Scottish and British identity. Bella Caledonia can be understood as a visual depiction of Bella Baxter. In Sterling's assertion, you have the brain, the psychological identity, as feeling Scottish, although the physical body representing this identity is the British government. I aim to invert Sterling's framework. Rather than viewing Bella Caledonia as a national representation, I'll instead use the local Bella Baxter as a representation of the local city of Glasgow. I'm interested in the duality of Bella Baxter. She's a hybrid creation made up of body and mind, mother and child, past and present. And like Sterling, I've decided to divide Bella into two, where I'll view the body as belonging to Victoria and representing Glasgow's industrious past, and the brain belonging to Bella Baxter, representing the city's new cultural identity of 1990. In the novel, this idea of transformation is everywhere. As Bella Baxter explains, movement turns dead dogs into maggots and daisies, and flour, butter, sugar, and egg in a tablespoonful of milk into Abernethy biscuits. And movement causes pain and when solid bodies knock into living ones or living ones knock each other. So to stop us getting knocked dead before life wears us out, we have generated, developed, evolved, acquired, invented, matured, gained and grown eyes and brains to let us see knocks coming and dodge them, and how beautifully the whole godly clamjamfrey works. Before I delve into the allegory of the novel, I'm going to give a brief overview of how Glasgow's identity transformed between the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 19th century, Glasgow forged its identity as an industrial powerhouse with a significant working class population. Following the First World War, Glasgow's industries fell into prolonged decline, and although this picked up slightly during World War II to aid the war effort, this did not last. With the closure of factories and shipyards, global competition, the creation of new towns outside of Glasgow, the deployment of around 250,000 people out of the city, alongside the construction of the motorway through predominantly working class neighbourhoods and the creation of the high-rise flats, the city experienced mass unemployment, poor housing and dire social conditions, ultimately forging the negative outward image of a suffering city. Now, it's all quite dire, but for the working classes in Glasgow, it's important to recognise that this was often the reality of what they lived through. By 1983, Glasgow attempted to rebrand itself and shake off this sort of dirty and dangerous image by launching the Glasgow's Miles Better campaign to change the city's outward image and encourage people to view Glasgow in a more positive light. Having done the groundwork by 1986, Glasgow prepared itself for a full transformation, shedding off its industrial past, as the city was nominated as the European City of Culture for 1990. However, this identity transformation did not come without its backlash, particularly from the Workers' City Group, who formed in 1988 in response to Glasgow's nomination as the European City of Culture. The Worker City group was made up of around 60 artists, writers, activists, and trade unionists, including the like of Alasdair Gray and James Kelman. And the group named themselves the Worker City in direct opposition to the contemporary rebranding of the historic centre of Glasgow as the Merchant City. The group aimed to contest the ownership of Glasgow and its culture, and to highlight that within the construction of the new Glasgow of 1990, working people and the working classes who the group represented were being marginalised and erased in the cultural year. I'm going to start by analysing the ways in which we can compare Victoria's mind and body to Glasgow's Victorian industrial past by investigating the real locations that are anchored onto her narrative. Gray's choice to name the character Victoria also suggests this tie between Victoria and the Victorian era. The most crucial of these locations is the Clyde, where Victoria ends her life. So by fusing Victoria's death to a river so bound to the city's industrial success, the real Glasgow comes back into view. Further, when Victoria jumps into the Clyde, Godwin states, "She did not jump feet first like most suicides. She dived clean under like a swimmer, but expelling the air from her lungs, not drawing it in, for she did not return to the surface alive." We can compare Victoria's last breaths, expelling the air from her lungs, as perhaps the last bellows of smoke leaving Glasgow's chimneys during the city's prolonged deindustrialisation. Diaz-Martinez notes that the Victorian Glasgow we see in Poor Things recovers images of Glasgow's invisible past and reclaims lost ideals of previous eras. This idea of Glasgow's invisible past is akin to Gray's lost civilization. Although Glasgow still contains the physical legacy of the Clyde, its function has changed since the Victorian era. By tying Victoria's death to the Clyde, we see the Victorian legacy of Glasgow's physical city, like Victoria's body, is not lost but transformed. As Victoria's brain is replaced with that of her unborn child, only Victoria's body, her physical legacy, remains, and this is portrayed with an unknown scar on her stomach. And Glasgow too conveys the physical memory of the past with the River Clyde, which physically divides the city into two. In the novel, we see a growing curiosity in Bella surrounding her physical past, which we know is Victoria's body. Duncan Wedderburn makes Bella aware of that she has a caesarean scar on her stomach, and Bella then writes to Godwin saying, "I had a baby once, God. Is that true?" We can understand Bella's question as, "Where is my creation?" though her question should perhaps be, "Who created me?" Through Bella asking of her origins without any knowledge of her physical past, she struggles to find harmony between her physical body and her psychological identity, which ultimately creates tension between her past and present self. In Glasgow, the Clyde is an important site regarding Glasgow's history and identity. As the historian Sidney Checkland asserts, the Clyde reorientated the city in space. From this, we can see how Glasgow's industrial identity is influenced by its physical makeup, and likewise, its physical makeup influences its identity. The Clyde is an enduring symbol of Glasgow's working class culture and an insight into the city's history. However, since the 1980s, it has been moulded to fit commercialism, entertainment, and business. Historian Ralph Richter asserts that industrial heritage sites can act as containers of memory, which provide meaning to the existence of cultural groups and of their history. Although he states very few industrial relics remain to represent and preserve the city's industrial working class history. The transformation of the Clyde has ultimately erased its working class heritage, creating hollows in identity. In the same way that Victoria's body is left with scars from her past, Glasgow is left with the physical layout of a city historically built for industry, both permanent physical features with ambiguous historical significance to their present identities, making the Clyde perhaps the city's biggest scar. If Victoria's body can act as a representation of Glasgow's industrial physical past, then Bella could be viewed as an allegory of Glasgow's transformed cultural identity of 1990. Though, if we're comparing Bella to Glasgow's new identity, then we should also consider Godwin's allegorical role as the creator of Bella. In this sense, we can understand Godwin as having a similar role to the Glasgow District Council, who conceived the new Glasgow of 1990. In 1986, Glasgow was selected as the next European City of Culture, which, for several reasons, was met with speculation. Unlike previous winners, such as Athens, Amsterdam, and Paris, who were the capital cities of their respective countries and already acknowledged cultural centres, Glasgow was not the capital city of Scotland. It was the first post-industrial city to win the award, and its outward image of violence, poor health, and squalor did not project the Eurocentric images often associated with the Culture Award. In Poor Things, this is mirrored by the recreation of Victoria into Bella. Firstly, Victoria's life was deemed so abysmal that she chose to end it. Archibald displays scepticism surrounding Godwin's creation of Bella by combining an adult body with an infant brain. And upon learning of her conception, Archibald states, "As I sipped the dark ruby syrup, I suddenly felt that Baxter, his household, Miss Bell, yes, and me, and Glasgow, and rural Galloway, and all Scotland were equally unlikely and absurd." For both the local council and Godwin, Bella and Glasgow's past was something to be ashamed of. We see this in the novel where Godwin tells Archibald that if he had reanimated Victoria, she would have been put in a mental hospital or jail. This is echoed by the local council, who believed Glasgow's past was so deeply entrenched with poverty and poor health that the only way to encourage regeneration was to wipe the slate clean and create a new identity for the city. And this can be seen in their manifesto for 1990, where they wrote, "You can't stand still. You can't rely on the achievements of the past, no matter how impressive these may have been. Glasgow's days as a great industrial city are over. Sad as this may seem, its consequences are clear. Set out to become a great post-industrial city." Further, Godwin's dissection and reconfiguration of Victoria's deceased body reveals an imbalanced power dynamic between class representation and image construction for Glasgow in 1990. For Glasgow's local authorities, the cultural arena was one of the few areas they still retained control over, as the UK's Conservative government restricted much of the local power to Glasgow. The role of Godwin in deciding Victoria's fate mirrors the local council in their reconfiguration of Glasgow's identity in 1990. Further, Godwin's upper-class status illuminates the disparity between the neoliberal business makers and the working classes during 1990. The Workers' City aired their frustrations regarding this, suggesting the local council were using enormous amounts of public money to control and redefine Glasgow for an outward audience. The new Glasgow of 1990 was created through image making and reframing the narrative of the city to project a positive outward image. In the novel, Archibald raises the idea that Godwin's experiment has created a surgical fabrication, and this is echoed by the negative feelings of the Worker City group, who felt that Glasgow of 1990 was sanitising the real working class culture and cultural history of Glasgow from the synthetically created new image. If Bella, a woman without a past, is a surgical fabrication, then she too presents this synthetic quality the Worker City saw in Glasgow's transformed identity of 1990. Godwin also invents Bella's past and history, stating that she was a distant niece whose parents died in a railway accident, a disaster where she sustained a concussion, causing total amnesia. Godwin's new identity for Bella further exposes a power imbalance between them, as he asserts himself as the creator of her new identity and the author of her history. This was a major area of contention too from the worker side, who felt that the working class history of Glasgow was being rewritten, erasing the realities of the city's inhabitants. Although my analysis today has predominantly focused on the Worker City critique of the City of Culture Award, it's important to state that the award did in fact allow Glasgow to transform its negative outward image and has since been adopted as a blueprint for post-industrial cities to regenerate through culture. In the novel, as Bella becomes a successful independent socialist after being transformed, there is space to investigate Glasgow in the same light, which I plan to do in future. As we've learned today, transformation is a process which involves disappearance, and in 1990, the working classes bore the brunt of the city's regeneration. In many ways, Bella's search for her past reflects the worker city group plea for working class history to be acknowledged within the cultural year. Bella believes she is only half a woman without her past, as her psychological makeup differs from the physical body that represents it. And through the same lens, we can view Glasgow of 1990, projecting a renewed cultural identity in the same physical city, though with little acknowledgement of its past. Therefore, where Bella views herself as only half a woman without her past, Glasgow too could be considered as only half a city. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lauren, for all your insights. For those of you who are interested, Lauren has been great over the last year or so, sharing some of her research in various different ways. She's helped develop a resource for us for our portable educational resource called the Travelling Archive, and she's also providing us with some content for some future works we're developing, including a couple of walking tours, one of which we're just starting to develop with Radical Glasgow tours. So I'm really delighted to introduce next Henry Bell, who's got many different talents, but is an award-winning writer, poet and organiser living in Glasgow. So his work is across poetry, theatre and non-fiction. It explores questions of radical memory, community and the revolutionary transformation of society. In 2015, he received a Glybilt Poetry Apprenticeship, and in 2019, he received a New Writers Award for Poetry from the Scottish Book Trust. He writes occasionally for the Morning Star. He's a committee member of the Red Sunday School and a founder member of the Workers' Theatre and Radical Glasgow tours too. He's going to be talking a little bit this evening about his connection to Gray's work through the projects that Gray was included in, including Haneen, which is a bilingual adaptation of Alasdair Gray's iconic novel 1982 Janine, co-written with Sarah Sharwari. Also, he's going to specifically look at A Bird Is Not a Stone, which is an anthology that Hussein mentioned earlier on contemporary Palestinian poetry, edited by Henry and Sarah Irving. So handing over now to Henry. Thank you.
Hiya, thanks so much, Sorcha, and Lauren and Hussein for those really fascinating talks. And want to also echo what Hussein said, that it's a real privilege to be speaking on imperialism and Gray with the Alasdair Archive today in the context of the renewed onslaught on Gaza, and I appreciate very much that these are practical and current subjects and ones that the Alasdair Gray Archive is actively engaged in and supportive of. And I think that's a really meaningful thing and a really bold representation of Alasdair's own political legacy. So I'm really pleased to be here. I am going to talk about A Bird Is Not a Stone, largely a book of Palestinian poetry that I worked on partly with Alasdair, and a few other things. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Is that allowed?
Yeah, this share option should be on, Henry. Yep.
Sorry. There we go. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
There we go. So I'm going to talk about Alasdair Gray translating poetry and the struggle in Palestine. So I'll start a little bit by gratuitously showing you this picture that Alasdair did of me. So I'll talk about myself briefly. So I am, as Sorcha said, a writer, an organizer. I'm interested in revolutionary histories, in ways in which we can use poetry and literature to engage in the struggle to transform society. And the ways in which I first encountered both Alasdair Gray and Palestine were through the occupation of the Hetherington House at Glasgow University. So in 2011, a group of students took over the Hetherington Research Club, which was a postgraduate club. And we held it in the end for 6 months, demanding an end to compulsory redundancies, the restoration of arts courses, more democratic oversight at the university, and more provision for postgrads and also international scholarships including scholarships for Palestinian students that had been won by a former occupation and then reneged on by the senior management group. And it was through all of that that I first met Alasdair, because he would come to the occupation, he would give us lectures and contribute to the political and artistic life of the occupation. I mean, I also through that ended up visiting Palestine. So I had until that point always been engaged in the left, but had not had a particularly engaged process when it came to the Palestinian struggle, and I met people who encouraged me to visit. And so in 2011, I visited Palestine for the first time. Here's a snapshot I took while I was there. And my experience there was of a really transformational nature. It was not just encountering the apartheid and colonialism of the Israeli system in Palestine. It was also encountering a kind of complete break of faith with what I'd been taught through university, what I'd understood from things like the BBC, and to really realize that the lives of Palestinians, the life that they were subjected to under Israel's regime, really was something so much more extreme and shocking than this kind of both sidesism that I'd been led to understand. And that really transformed how I viewed all kinds of political things. And when I came back to Scotland, I really wanted to find a way to engage with the Palestinian resistance. And I had other friends who, had trades, were builders, were nurses, could go over and do things. I'm a writer, and it was not entirely obvious to me what to do. But I met with various writers back in Glasgow. I met with Alasdair, I met with Liz Lockhead, and I met particularly with Tom Leonard. And I wanted to speak a bit about James Kelman and Alasdair Gray and Liz Lockhead and Tom Leonard as a kind of unit. I know that they've been written about before in terms of a kind of myth of them coming through Philip Hobsbawm's writing group and ending up as this kind of cultural force. And it's a myth that almost echoes the kind of the myth of 1990 and the cultural city of capital and the Glasgow miracle. The reality is much more prosaic. They variously did interact with Philip Hobsbawm, but not at the same time. They found each other through different writing groups and political things. But what is remarkable, and I think has been underwritten on, is the fact that these four huge international literary figures, Tom Leonard, James Kelman, Alasdair Gray, and Liz Lockhead, all came from distinct working class backgrounds and maintained working class political and creative identities throughout their life, were all colleagues and friends and comrades, and all supported each other in interesting ways through their politics and writing. Liz Lockhead's first collection was typeset, and that was paid for by Alasdair Gray, who'd received an Arts Council grant and wanted to spread the money. Alasdair used to discuss plots for things like Poor Things with Tom while they played chess. All these things created a kind of rich network between them. And I think particularly their anti-imperialist politics are interlinked and related and much stronger for their variants. So I think you can broadly separate the four of them into Alasdair and Liz, whose approach to anti-colonialism and their approach to the Palestinian question when I came to them back in 2011 was very much to see it through the framework of the Scottish struggle for self-determination and to understand the Palestinian quest for statehood in parallel to a Scottish quest for statehood. Not that they saw Scotland as straightforwardly colonised, but that they saw parallels in that need. Whereas Tom Leonard and James Kelman, I think, were much more prone to understand it in terms of the Irish struggle and to view the Irish Revolution, the liberatory politics of the Irish Republican Army in the first half of the 20th century, and the struggle then in the second half of the 20th century, and to map that onto their understanding of Palestine and imperialism. And I think those approaches obviously reflect their own backgrounds and their own political interests, but they also reflect the ability that all four of them had to hold that space together and to engage in it together. And I think very often you come across things in their work where an idea has clearly been supported or implanted by one of the other ones, and they've been able to grasp things such as feminism or colonialism, take hold of them and discuss them together. I think also Hussein mentioning the CND and the anti-Polarist movement was really central for all of them. They were all involved in that. And in fact, it was Mordecai Vanunu, the Israeli whistleblower who revealed the Israeli nuclear program, who was central in many ways to what happened at Glasgow University around first engaging with the Palestinian struggle at a time when Tom and Alasdair and Liz were on staff at the university, and Mordecai became rector in a kind of presage of the current rector, Hassan Abu Sitta, and that moved towards more political rectors for the university. But yeah, so I chatted to Tom and Alasdair about what could be done as artists and what the movement could do with the Scottish arts, and the suggestion was to run a trip to Palestine. And so the following year in 2012, I took a group of poets out to Palestine. Here's Liz Lochhead here in Ida refugee camp, talking with some of the Shabab, some of the young team. Myself, Liz, the singer and poet Lorna McBain, the Gaelic academic and story writer Gilabridge Macmillan, William Letford, Henry King. We travelled around the West Bank. We met with different organisations. We took messages of solidarity from Scottish writers, and we held workshops in places like the Laji Centre. This is a view from above the Laji Centre in Ida refugee camp, looking at the apartheid wall. Al-Hakhawati, the theatre in Jerusalem, in Al-Quds, the Freedom Theatre in Jenin, Hebron University in Al-Khalil, and eventually meeting the Union of Palestinian Writers at the House of Poetry in Albeira. And the tour was really, really profound and moving, not least in terms of the cultural connection it fostered. And when we arrived at the House of Poetry, it was really striking, and Liz Lochhead in particular felt very embarrassed for all of us that the poets we met there were able to talk at length about Edwin Morgan and Alasdair Gray, and they knew a great deal about Scottish literature, contemporary Scottish literature, and also historic Scottish literature, and our ignorance was pretty glaring when it came. And that imbalance in translation, that imbalance in knowledge is obviously a part of the colonial relation between Britain and Palestine, between Scotland and Palestine. And you know, similar to what Hussein was saying about Burma, there's a specific relation between Scotland and Palestine. Scotland has a specific role through Balfour and the Balfour Agreement in the appropriation of Palestinian lands. It also disproportionately provided the foot soldiers for the British occupation, the long British occupation from 1916 to 1948 that paved the way for the state of Israel. I've been, you know, in Bethlehem, where you see Palestinian police officers in tartan playing the bagpipes. That cultural presence is still there. But the only real poet that we were aware of and that was widely translated into English at that time was Darwish, who's, of course, you know, a great poet and an important figure, but one that left us kind of without access to the broad world of Palestinian writing. And it was also central that that what is translated into English and why it also has its own colonial and anti-colonial manifestations. And the poets at the House of Poetry in Albeira and in the General Union of Palestinian Writers really emphasized that whoever chooses to translate Palestinian poetry has their ends in choosing what they translate, whether it's always to translate the poetry of resistance and to ignore the many other human elements to Palestinian poetry, or whether it's to translate poetry that specifically excludes the armed resistance and focuses on a kind of peaceful, both sides version of the story. And that they felt that they were frequently misrepresented where they were translated. So what came out of that was the idea to produce A Bird Is Not a Stone, which is a collection of Palestinian poetry in translation into English, Scots, Gaelic and Shetlandic. And Alasdair from the start was hugely supportive of this. I found an email of his that he sent me early on where he said, "I will gladly work on Palestinian poems as long as they are chosen by Palestinian poets." I think it's really interesting that he picked up on that straight away, as did the Union of Palestinian Writers, that the key was curation. And of course, Alasdair was well aware of the power of an editor, the power of the shaping and framing of a project. And he was insistent on that for A Bird Is Not a Stone. We worked on the project over 2 years, and it was kind of an exciting process of putting writers like Alasdair in touch with their corresponding poets in Palestine through bridge translators who worked on versions of the poems, kind of glossing it into Arabic and then discussing with both poets in Palestine and in Scotland how they wanted to shape and essentially make new poems out of these poems. It was never a project about literal translation, but about finding a way to preserve the poetry of the translations. The context in Palestine at that time was of the siege in Gaza, of the increasing bombing campaigns against Gaza, kind of known as mowing the lawn in Israeli military circles, and of at the time quite strong Israeli propaganda presence in Scotland. This was the Jewish National Fund, who were organising in Scotland and holding regular events. Israeli arts organisations being brought to the Edinburgh International Festival. And I guess the reason I raise that is because, again, something quite key happened, I think, with having Alasdair Gray in the context of Tom Leonard and James Kelman and Liz Lockhead, that they were able to really be at the forefront of talking about how the culture should respond to that. And through their experiences with the anti-apartheid campaign in South Africa and with the cultural boycott there, they very quickly accepted the idea of a cultural boycott. And perhaps when Hussein mentioned that the density with which organisations endorse PACB is higher in Scotland than anywhere else, I wonder if that's a legacy of those writers and their own work and their own commitment to not cross that picket line and to understand that their Palestinian colleagues and comrades had asked that of them, and that it was crucial to maintain that boycott, however painful it might be. And I know that particularly Liz Lockhead has written about how what an act of pain it feels to reject Israeli arts for this period. But I found another thing that Alasdair had written to me then when there was an Israeli theatre company coming to Glasgow, I think at that point in 2014, and he had written of how much he would want to support a Jewish theatre in Scotland and how great the Jewish theatre, the Jewish Institute players had been in Glasgow, how much it had contributed, but that while the current situation was going on, he would boycott any Israeli theatre. And this was a strong position to take and a powerful position early in the BDS campaign. And it came in for a lot of backlash. People like Hadley Freeman and Maureen Lipman wrote and spoke publicly that the likes of Alasdair Gray and Liz Lockhead were fomenting anti-Semitism with these views, and that was really presaging the kind of way in which that battle would become central under Corbynism. I think that the real strength of these writers together was in being able to serve as figureheads for an artistic movement in Glasgow that really laid down a clear line on this and really clearly stated that that what had been asked of us by Palestinian civil society was very clear and very easy and very necessary. And I think that Alasdair's own understanding of British imperialism, of British imperialism's relation to Scotland, and of the complicated ways in which that had then led to Scottish participation in colonialism around the world was really, really key in how they related to these this request from these Palestinian authors. When we held the launch events, darling, I'm just working at the moment, sweetheart. Sorry. See? Sorry about that. Interestingly, I was just going to mention that one of the projects that came out of this that Sorcha had mentioned was working on Haneen, a translation of 1982 Janine into Arabic and performing it in Cairo. I did that with my friend Sarah Sharawi, who's currently babysitting my children, who you can hear in the next room. But part of that project was mapping the nuclear threat of Glasgow and the situation that takes place in the novel, where Glasgow exists almost on the edge of total destruction at all times, onto the experience of people in Cairo in the Middle East, where similarly to Fastlane's location on the Clyde, Israel's location in Palestine creates this endless feeling of an end of days situation. I wanted to talk a little bit about the poems and poets that Alasdair chose to translate in the book. He actually worked on several other versions, and I am gutted to say that it was my Glasgow Uni email address that he sent me these on, which no longer exists, it's long since defunct, and I was trying to find any shred of it. I wonder if anywhere deep in the archive there might be some of the other translations Alasdair sent, but the ones that were published, as Hussein said, were these two. And this first one is by a poet called Bisan Abu Khalid, who is a doctor and poet. She was born in Yarmouk camp in Damascus and returned after the Oslo Accords to Palestine. Her family were from Jenin. She wrote this poem that Alasdair has translated for us. I'll read it quickly. Lenin thought the world could be a homeland without boundaries for all, O loved one. Face bad things he did not foresee. Minutes erode all women, even those not first bled down to a dry ghost by nostalgia, our vampire bat. Will one day none see on a new faked map the name of she who is mine, my loved homeland, Palestine? I think it's easy to see why Alasdair was drawn to the poem. Dispositions that he has towards the idea of faked maps, the ideas of nostalgia, the idea of a kind of bold Leninist Marxist reality, and then finding some way to compromise that with national feeling. Lenin, of course, did see roots to that through Ireland, and perhaps we could come back to some of Kelman's ideas within that. The other poem of translation of Alasdair's in the book is this from Tarek Al-Kami, Not Only Rivers. I actually spoke with Tarek today, and he was really delighted to hear of this event going ahead. He had fond memories of dialogue with Alasdair about this, and he sent his greetings. He's in Tulkarm refugee camp in the north of the West Bank, and he wanted to communicate that they're currently again besieged by the Israeli military in the camp, that he has elderly family members with him who say that this feels like a third displacement after 1948 and 1967. They feel again that 2024 and 2025 is the same experience as those years. So it's nice to have him in our thoughts and to hear that message from him. This was Alasdair's translation. Not only rivers have a source. Paths trickle from single dwellings till, fed by tracks from villages, they go through towns and cities, swelled by tributary streets till they end in mighty ports and seaside resorts. Roads die when people's hopes, fears, wishes, traffic no longer flow through them, unlike rivers, which are not made by fishes. I love this poem, and again, I think Alasdair's connection to it and what he brings out in it about this idea of man-made boundaries, man-made cities, the ways in which those realities are perpetuated by this endless flow of people, I think really connects to that idea of how he viewed Glasgow and what he saw as making and creating Glasgow. I wanted to finish this with reading a poem that I've been reading a lot from the collection, and there's a lot in the collection that speaks to the current moment, and this is from a poet called Zuhair Abu Shayab, and it's a version by John Glenday, and the bridge translation was by Zoe Dexter at the University of Manchester. Martyr. When they found him, he had become an emerald flame, and when they lifted his arms, they found sheaves of wheat where a heart should be, and they say those sheaves were whispering beneath his shirt. And they say the wild birds ferried his blood to his family drop by drop. And they say he will come back suspended in the hidden tree at the burning heart of volcanoes, and that his mother will fold him in her arms. But when they found him, he was an emerald flame. So they stitched together rose petals for a shroud and smoothed out the sky to keep him warm. And for a pillow, they lifted down the sun and laid it beneath his head. Have I managed to unshare that? Here we go. There we go. Yeah, I found it a deeply powerful experience to work with Alasdair on that collection, and again on Haneen, where we worked translating 1982 Janine and transposing it into Cairo. And I guess my kind of interest in some of the questions that it raised for me was the way in which Alasdair's universe at once centered Glasgow and centered a Glaswegian experience, but also saw that experience as inherently cosmopolitan, inherently connected to the injustices of empire and the ways in which imperial violence that was spread out from Glasgow also was moved back into the city itself, and the ways in which people were dispossessed in tandem in the slums of Glasgow and in the colonies, and the ways in which that ruling class and as he would say himself, a specifically Scottish capitalist ruling class and a Scottish understanding of capitalism produced those things, and how by translating Palestinian work into a Glaswegian context and Glaswegian work out of it, there were ways in which to both challenge those imperialisms, but also illuminate them and reveal the ongoing colonialisms and fascisms at home and abroad. Thanks so much. I think that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Henry. Can I also just check for those people who are maybe interested in reading A Bird Is Not a Stone, is that available for people to be able to access and read?
A Bird Is Not a Stone is not currently available. I would really love to make it available. Really, essentially, it just needs to be scanned and put online. It's out of print, sadly, and copies go for quite a lot of money online. So if anyone feels that they have the energy and technology to scan and put it online, then that would be a great thing to do, I think.
Well, great. Well, we should talk more about that anyways, or even at least try and share some of Alasdair's translations as part of that too. But thank you so much, Henry. I'm going to hand over to Rodge, who's going to steer us through the next part of the presentation, which is really a bit of a Q&A. So it's an opportunity, I know, throughout the course of the webinar today, people have been sharing their thoughts, questions and reflections. So Rodge has been bringing them together. As I mentioned at the top, Rodge is senior lecturer at creative writing at Strathclyde. We partner on quite a lot of projects, but this is a project that we've worked on together that's been supported by SGSAH. So I'll hand over to Rodge now, who'll take us through the next part.
Thanks so much, Sorcha. Thank you very much. Thank you, Hussein. Thank you, Henry. Hi, Henry. I didn't get a chance to say hi before we started, and thank you hugely to Lauren. I've always got plenty to say and plenty to ask, but it would be amazing if we got some questions in through the chat. If you want to send them, you're very welcome to, and I'm happy to share those. Let me just check what's just come in. I think maybe people are offering to retype A Bird Is Not a Stone for you already, Henry. I think we might get this done today. Who knows? That would be amazing. And I would like to talk to you about that as well. Alasdair Watson seems to have a copy. There we are. See, communities at work as we speak. That would be wonderful. I'm conscious that we don't have a huge amount of time, so it would be great if I could just get to one question to each of you. I'm just going to go in order in the way that we laid out the event today. Hussein, I should answer one or two things that you asked, and then I've got a question for you. You asked, did Alasdair Gray understand his political role more as he got older? And you mentioned the CND process and quoted the A.L. Kennedy CND protest where she saw him being arrested. In fact, I have a photograph of that incident in my office of Alasdair being arrested, and I don't think that he gloried in it at all. In fact, we talked about it quite a bit, and he was sort of deeply uncomfortable, but he protested because he felt like he would feel worse if he didn't. He wasn't the kind of person that took like an active pleasure in it. You could see that it somehow built him up or gave him confidence or something. I think he felt not compromised exactly, but just sort of uncomfortable and being strident, because he often said that what he believed in most was in doubt and was interested in making people doubt themselves more. So it was counterintuitive in certain ways, but that he found these ways through written work and through activism to be able to feel less guilty, which is his terminology. In fact, 23 years ago, I typed that piece about the Iraq War. I was the secretary for that whole of that collection, The Ends of Our Tethers. And he was deeply uncomfortable even writing it. I've never had a chance to be able to go back to, and I'd love to. But there's something to be said there about sort of discomfort in protest, perhaps, that's worth exploring. And that, he could have said, well, I don't feel comfortable, so I'm not going to, and didn't. So I'd love to be able to pick that up with you at some point. I realize that's a statement, not a question, but a question is coming, unless you wanted to respond to that.
That's really interesting, yeah.
A quick thing on Adam's blackness in Greenhead Church. So I'm delighted to hear that that's a favourite of yours. It's also an absolute favourite of mine. For those that don't know, Greenhead Church, Alasdair worked on for 4 years, and it existed for about a decade in Bridgeton in Glasgow. They knocked it down to make way for the motorway and then put the motorway elsewhere. And if you're ever looking for a metaphor about the ways in which Glasgow has destroyed itself needlessly, there's definitely one sitting in there somewhere. You're quite right about the Atheist Paints God article, which is a favourite headline of mine as well. But it was definitely controversial for him to be putting a black Adam and a white Eve in embrace in the Garden of Eden in the 1960s in Glasgow, like hugely so. What he did repeatedly was to recycle those images, particularly if work that he had created had been lost, destroyed, painted over, neglected. And later on in his life, of course, he redid it again in the Oran Moor Auditorium, which is now on the very highest part of the ceiling. And a sign that maybe not everything in our world is moving backwards all the time. Nobody cared the second time. It wasn't in the slightest bit controversial. And it's my absolute favourite bit of the Oran Moor Auditorium. Alasdair and recycling, there's plenty to be said there. The question I wanted to ask you, Hussein, was related to your quote from Chitra Ramaswamy. I'm really glad that you reached into Chitra's work. In the quote that you used, she was reflecting on how she'd initially thought Poor Things was a feminist novel when she first read it, returned to it and saw it as a novel about colonialism. And I drew out what you said about an excess of meaning and a surplus of meaning in texts, how we each find different things in the same novel, and there's more than can be contained in one mind. I'm interested in your particular response to Poor Things. Like, did you find anything in it that surprised or changed the way that you see things when you went back to it for this project?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I guess, yeah, without wanting to mirror exactly what Chitra is saying, I think when I first read it as an undergrad, it didn't quite register how that kind of the forcefulness of the critique of colonialism in that work. I think it becomes more legible maybe in different historical moments.
What you're saying, what Chitra's saying are very commonly said about Poor Things. Why do you think that is, that one seems so obvious to readers and another it seems hidden in a way?
I'm not sure. I'm also not sure that there's because in the novel, those things about feminist emancipation and anti-colonialism are elided. Like, thinking about what Lauren was saying as well in your amazing presentation, Lauren, I think the whole thing about one character has the potential to either have recourse to this imperialist identity as Victoria McCandless, but also has the possibility of not just national self-determination and being like a new Scotland, but also feminist self-determination as a socialist woman. And I think I just think that those two images are kind of on top of each other, and you can't really separate them out. So I just see it as all part of the sorry, is that just like a bit of a cop-out answer?
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's coherent. It makes absolute sense. We can pick it up. I like to say at the beginning of a longer conversation sometimes. It's almost impossible to do briefly. But I appreciate it. And we must also pick up on Old Men in Love very soon as well, which I think is a novel it's had almost nothing said about
It's
it.
quite amazing. I think that was the real revelation in doing this work is, yeah, how incredible that, because also people, I think I read some reviews of it and it's like, do people not get that this is a great novel? And it just, I guess because a lot of it is taken from other bits and bobs, but I think it's really amazing.
Yeah, it was rooted in 3 plays from the 70s. And I think that in a way he affected the critical response to it by openly declaring that these were 3 leftover plays from the 70s that he didn't know what to do with. And so he grafted this other thing onto it. And there was the return of Sidney Workman from Lanark as well. But I would like to go back and read it now. I last read it when we were typing it up and I still worked with it. Thank you. I'm going to tag out and tag back in again. Lauren, I've got a question for you, as if I don't ask you enough questions. Are you there?
Yep.
Hi. Hi. Okay, so I mean, I'm interested in your response to the city, how the whole City of Culture period maybe now looks now. It's interesting that you're able to go in depth into what the response was of writers and artists in the city at the time and what their fears were and expectations about how it would affect the city of Glasgow to be presented in this way, and what they saw as a kind of sanitized version of Scotland, or or de-Glasgowify it. But we're 35 years later now. You mentioned that this was then used as a blueprint for lots of other cities as well. I wonder if the time that's passed since helps us see Poor Things and Bella in body and brain, as you're presenting her, in a different light at all to the way she might have been seen in 1990.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know if I'm 100% there being able to answer it yet. But I will get to that in the chapter eventually.
The chapter that you're writing for your PhD.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. We'll update everybody later on then, shall we?
But I mean, I think it's just kind of interesting in the context of like the 1990s and all the kind of accounts within the novel that are at play, and the way that Alasdair Gray kind of used the past to speak to the present, like using this Victorian setting to really speak about contemporary issues that he saw in the city. But then he also kind of, within both of the accounts, you sort of are left with either Bella Baxter or Victoria McCandless as both being this sort of independent socialist future.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I kind of find interesting about it. But yeah, I don't think I'm informed enough to know now how she could be represented. But maybe that's another PhD for after this one.
Okay, do one at a time, will you?
Yeah.
Okay, further research required. Lovely.
Yeah.
Very good. Elegantly responded to. Henry. Oh, sorry, go on. Lauren, were you done? Were you going to say
I
something?
just wanted to say something about what Hussein was talking about with
Please do.
sort of Alasdair Gray coming into his politics kind of later in life. I think just based on some of the research I've done, it's just the kind of subtleties that bled into his kind of art and writing over time, kind of reflect like the C&D movement, the protest, because he was asked to do a sort of Highland landscape, to do a painting of the Holy Loch, just commissioned to do it, I think in the 1970s. And he sort of did the Holy Loch, and the person who wanted it wanted this like lovely Highland landscape, a beautiful scene. And Alasdair Gray said that he sort of couldn't resist but putting these like dark, gloomy clouds all over it, kind of reflecting that idea of like fear and worry. And then what I find interesting in that is that sort of Cowcaddon streetscape painted in the 1960s kind of has the same sort of fear and trepidation and anxiety kind of in it. So that kind of those kind of ideas of him coming into his politics and reflecting his politics, kind of it was always there, you know, like an undercurrent, even in the subtleties of his work.
Yeah, I think it was always there too. I mean, if you look at his very first mural, it was literally called Horrors of War. It was in the Scottish USSR Friendship Society, which the very existence of which was hugely controversial. It was a job given. Sorcha will correct me if I go off. Hopefully, she'll like zap me through from the other room. But it was partially a commission that he got from his headmaster at Glasgow School of Art at the time, because they knew he was hugely talented, but also couldn't keep to time or turn up for his exams or do what he was told. And also they knew that most students wouldn't want to be associated with that. And it was hardly seen, and then it was disappeared. So I think it's more that he had more of a platform as he got older. You know, also people would come to him, and you have to take a greater sense of responsibility when you have a higher profile, I think. Like the imagined set of Declaration of Scottish Independence that he wrote with James Kelman could only be the kind of thing that would happen later on in his life when he's more experienced, but also when people were looking to him more. You have to have more than a thumbnail article that says atheist paints God in order to be able to have an impact. Yeah. I'm glad you raised that. Thank you. I'm dying to get to a question for Henry before we finish up. And I will promise you, Sorcha.
Can I jump in on a worker city thing, actually? Just
you absolutely can, yeah.
Just with you kind of asking about what the real legacy was after that kind of moment of confrontation between the city of culture and the worker city. And I was looking at this recently in the introduction to the first worker city anthology. Farquhar MacLeay, the Gorbals anarchist, says you know, the news of it being the city of culture rings hollow around the poverty ghettos at the edge of the city. And there are currently, this is in 1988, 8,000 people homeless within the city. Scotland incarcerates a higher rate of its population than any European country other than Turkey at this time. And that 13 people died in police custody in the last year in Scotland. And I looked that up, and today there are 8,000 people homeless within the city of Glasgow. Scotland still incarcerates more of its population than any other European state, bar Turkey. And last year, 32 people died in police custody in Scotland. And I think the fact that the preoccupations of that writers group are still so current, and the like material reality of the city is still so identical, really bears out how important what they were saying at that time was, and how correct they were that this kind of window dressing in the city centre and renaming the new town the Merchant City was going to be of no real relation to people in the city. And then I'd add to that Alasdair's contribution to that anthology is a defence of his friend Elspeth King, who was then the curator at the People's Palace, but had lost her job in what was quite obviously a political move by the City Council to force a prominent socialist historian out of the museums department. And right now the People's Palace is shuttered, and they're reorganizing that collection. And I think it would be a great thing for anyone here and anyone interested to contact Glasgow Life and the city and say, we are really, really interested and concerned about what they're going to do with the People's Palace. And I think if Alasdair was still about, he'd be at the kind of forefront of a campaign to think about what the People's Palace is going to look like.
Thank you very much, Henry. Lauren, are you taking down those stats immediately for your PhD?
Yep.
Okay, all right, that's good. Thanks. Thanks very much, Henry. I don't mean to be flippant about that, but I can't resist. Henry, if I can just finish with one final question to you. I have to do an aside first. I've been dying to talk to you about the 1982 Janine play for a long, long time, and I would love to do so another time soon. I'm not sure if we'll get to that now, but if we don't, I promise to follow up. I wanted to ask you something about the technical task involved in choosing the poems and translating them for A Bird Is Not a Stone. You said the key is curation, and I would love to see any emails back and forth about Alasdair's translations. I don't know if anybody's written about that process, but if they haven't, then they should. Can you tell us more about the technical process of how poems written by Palestinian poets were either transposed or changed or shared with the writers over here, and then how they wrote these, what you call new poems, and not literal, but to preserve the poetry of the translations was, I think, the term that you used. Can you let us in on that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Joe Jackson wrote a thing about it for the Association of Scottish Literature, actually. That's
Oh, right, okay.
an interesting paper on it. But essentially, it was really led by the Union of Palestinian Writers. So it was their trade union that kind of assembled a huge selection of poems. I mean, it was extremely unwieldy and badly formatted. And then we got academics from Manchester and St Andrews and Edinburgh that all have quite strong Arabic departments to kind of do an initial, very, very rough translation of it. So we essentially had poets' names and a couple of samples from each poet. And we split that up, and then we had more volunteer translators who worked in contact with the original poets. And we then sent this huge, kind of quite messy, multilingual, kind of glossed version of all the poems in Arabic and English out, just to all the poets that had expressed interest in Awana. And they then sort of fought it out between themselves. So there was quite a lot of horse trading between poets about who wanted to work on what poem. And some of it fell quite naturally. There were poems that were more obviously suited to certain poets' interests. There were poems that were kind of big epic poems. And certainly you can see that Alasdair was drawn to kind of more epigrammatic and explicitly political, but not narrowly political poetry, I guess. Yeah, as I said, he actually worked on quite a lot of poems for it, and all the correspondence was in a now defunct email address. So I don't know if it exists anywhere on Alasdair's side or whether there might be some paper copies somewhere, but those were the ones we selected. And it was then a process once we'd assigned which poems they'd work on, they were put in contact with the bridge translator, and through the bridge translator, where possible, with the Palestinian poet. And so there was some discussion. And with Alasdair, I remember, as I said, with Tarek and Alasdair, they got on well, and there was, Tarek was just very delighted, I think, that Alasdair Gray was translating one of his poems and would have agreed to the translation. There were other places where it broke down a bit. Zakaria Mohammed, who was died last year, was one of the most prominent Palestinian poets at the time, loathed Kathleen Jamie's translations. And no matter how much I tried to explain to him that Kathleen was actually quite a good poet, doing quite a good job, he was really, really unhappy with how she'd rendered his work. So there were some times the wheels came off it, but not with Alasdair's translations.
Wow, that's fascinating. I'd love to hear more about it. 2 minutes past 7, Sorcha. Not too bad.
Very good. Thanks for your expert hosting of the Q&A, Rodge. Big thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. A big thanks again to Henry Bell, to Lauren Forde, to Rodge Glass and our partners at Creative Writing and Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities for making this event and Hussein's entire research project possible. But my big final thanks has to go to Hussein for just being a brilliant researcher to work with. You've really extended the collection here. That's what we're all about doing. And I think this is obviously a start of a longer conversation. Speaking of which, the first thing really is this resource that we'll be working on. So for those of you who are interested in finding out more about how we're pulling some of that research together, keep in touch with us on the socials. We'll be also posting it on the website too. But a big thank you. If you're local to Glasgow or close to the archive, please come and visit us. We do free weekly tours. We're always got those on our social media too. And for those of you who are further afield, keep in touch and explore some of our new digital projects that we're going to be working on the months ahead. But big thanks to everyone again for joining us this evening. And a final thanks to Henry, Lauren, Rodge and Hussein. Thank you. Good night.